Welcome to our second panel, which we've called The Status of Disability Studies in India. And we also asked the question of how academia, the academic study of disability in the Indian context, how that can or potentially can work also alongside activism and advocacy and so on. And I think the question for this particular roundtable is really about whether a kind of disability studies that has emerged very much in a Western kind of context, which emerged initially in the United States and in Britain, whether the range of theories, of concepts, of methods and so on, which developed for a particular context which we saw in those Western European and American countries, whether those ideas and concepts and theories and methods can simply be transplanted to the South Asian context. How useful are they in that context? I mean, in particular, I think traditionally in disability studies, certainly in Western Europe, there has been a kind of radical distinction, a kind of split between what we've called the medical model of disability, which sees disability as a kind of personal tragedy, something that happens to the individual and for which medical interventions are the correct and the appropriate kind of response. And we've opposed that to what came to be known as the social model, which was really the idea that it was society rather than a medical conditioning that was disabling. That I can't remember which activist or which theorist it was who said it, but there was a quote along the lines of moving in a wheelchair or moving without legs is only a problem in a world full of stairs. So it was about environmental barriers, about social barriers. And I think the question arises, particularly in the Indian context, although I think this also relates also in Western Europe and in the States too, whether it really makes sense to have this radical split, this kind of distinction between the medical on the one hand and the social on the other, as if these are two entirely separate things. I think in particular also things like the independent living movement in the United States, for example, which has been very powerful and has been very important to groups of disabled people living in those contexts. But I think we need to pose the question of whether that makes sense in a cultural context like those of South Asia. And of course, we're talking here about multiple social contexts. I'm not trying to suggest that South Asia is all one thing. But whether this idea of an independent living movement, which really emerges out of a society where autonomy, where independence, and these kinds of things are really valorized, where they're really important, whether it makes sense in communities where the collective is much more important, where independence may in itself not be considered something that's vital to being a human being or to being to being a person. And in fact, where often, certainly among the people I've worked with, where interdependence and family members working together and so on is given much greater kind of credence. So it's really in that context that I suppose I want to ask whether that kind of disability studies, the disability studies which has arisen in that context, works in a South Asian context. Do we simply need to adapt the ideas that we already have? Don't necessarily want to throw away good ideas. Or do we need to start completely again and look at what kind of theoretical tools, what kind of methodological tools that we might need in contexts where, for example, caste might become very important and other particularly South Asian kind of things. To coin a phrase, do we need to decolonize the disability studies curriculum in India? I mean, is another question that we might address. Now, around the table, we've got a range of scholars who have all been involved in disability studies in different ways in India. My name is James Staples. I'm a British anthropologist, but I've worked in India for the last 30 or so years, in particular with people affected by leprosy, but also with other people who identify as disabled in different ways. We also have, and I'm going to go round each member of the table to ask them to introduce themselves very, very quickly to start with. So no monologue, certainly don't speak as long as I have. Apologies for that. I'll get you to speak very, very briefly, just to introduce yourself, your name, your institutional affiliation, if you have one, and your particular connection to disability studies. So I'm going to start with Hema Chandra, who is on my right. Yeah, I'll give you the, and then I will pass on to Jagdish.
Good morning, all. Hema Chandra here. I teach literature in IIT Madras. My interest in disability studies comes from my study of literature and my own disability blindness. So I work on these concepts of representation and disability in literature and philosophy and so on. So that has been my persuasion.
Excellent, thank you. Jagdish?
Okay. Hi, good morning. My name is Jagdish Gandhi, and I teach political science at Hindu College in Delhi University for my bread making. But my research interest is certainly disability studies. Particularly my research has been on documenting the disability rights movement in India, particularly the self-advocacy movement of the blind. But I'm interested in cross-disability alliances and advocacy and disability rights in general.
Good morning. I'm Nikhil Jain. I teach at Dayal Singh College, University of Delhi. I'm also the president of a DPO called Sambhavana Organization, which works for the rights of disabled. It's an advocacy group for the past 2 decades. I would like to, because we have been not only having litigations, but doing certain academic activities like seminar and conferences. Though there are there are studies coming up on disabilities, on gender, law, and education. But I would like to just provoke you with 1 or 2 questions, that whether as a teacher, am I able to make the disability as a matter of discourse, a debate, a discussion inside class or outside class, whether it is catching the minds of the people as the caste and the gender do. And these are my preliminary questions. I think we may come as we have more discussions on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikhil. I am a medical doctor, Satyendra Singh from University College of Medical Sciences and GTB Hospital. I am co-founder of the Medical Humanities group at my medical college, as well as founder of Doctors with Disabilities group. And my dream is to introduce disability studies into the medical curriculum.
Hello everybody, my name is Thunman Bhattacharya. I am from the University of Delhi. I teach in a department of linguistics, so I am a linguist primarily. But I spend a lot of time in disability research, and I came to disability through linguistics, especially sign linguistics, Indian Sign Language linguistics, and there have been some dissertations, research degrees awarded in Indian Sign Language from my department, the students working with me, but also on other disability language interface issues like disability in proverbs, etc. But then I got into bigger interest. My bigger interest was education, and I started looking at education for children with disability as part of education in a multilingual country like India. So there's these 3 aspects of my academic existence: education, language or linguistics, and disability studies. But otherwise, I have been a little bit active in activism, disability activism, but also quite a bit of my past 15 years been on and off part of policy making at the higher education level, also at a local level at the university. We started the Equal Opportunity Cell in 2006. I think it was probably the earliest Equal Opportunity Cell in the country. And then I ran it for a year, but I was associated for many years. I introduced several courses there on sign language, and also on disability and human rights, which I taught for 3 years. And then I have been working at UGC in terms of making policies for as part of disability mission of the earlier government. In a way, I have been spending time in policy making, little bit of activism, and a lot of time in intellectual research activities. And I'm looking forward to the roundtable discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, all of you, and thank you also for your brevity. I think if we could start perhaps with another round before we open it up to the floor, just to try and get each of us to think a bit about maybe what is specific, if anything, about the Indian context that we might need to consider in forming a disability studies which is relevant specifically to this, to this context. I'm going to start with Hema again because I know he has to go earlier than the others. So I'll hand you the thing and then we'll go from the other way.
Thanks, James. Straight to the matter at hand. Disability studies in Indian context. Its transformative effects and evolution, in my view, maybe for this talk, we can focus on a particular problem, that is translatability. This has been coming in the discussion for the last 3 days. Translation, translatability, and so on. What is translation? Well, rendering something tangible from one medium to another, one language to another, one cultural context to another, and so on. In the first kind of translatability issue really involves making disability studies tangible in the university setting. How do we do that? Creating a canon, that is body of knowledge. Creating corpus, that is amount of data and narratives. Say language, say Thunman was talking about proverbs and so on. Creating corpus and creating an archive on which disability studies, which can be said that is local to our condition, local to Indian context, can be built on. As I see around, lots of work is already happening in this direction. For example, Deepa's own work in the field, creating huge corpus of materials that are inaccessible to an urban academic like me, for example. An archive, literary, philosophical, historical, linguistic, and other fields are developing. Many scholars are here already on that. But it has to come to tangible shape. Now the new government policy is that create disability studies center across all universities. It can have two effects. It can just routinize or habitualize disability studies, in which case it can get killed. The second possibility is that, well, it can give new opportunities for local universities beyond Delhi to develop localized scholarships that will add to the canon, which I'm talking about. So the first really is a tangibility question, make things available, tangible. The second translatability question, which is not unique to disability studies and still unique to disability studies, is the post-colonial context that we are all in. You know, we all read books written in English, primarily written by American and British and European writers, and critics and authors and so on, and somehow make it available locally, grind on it, munch on it, sometimes digest it, and so on. So that is a typical intellectual condition that we are in. How to translate that? But when I say this, I'm not really interested in Indian Western binary. that's not useful anymore, because that's not the reality is. Western and Indian realities commingle, intermix in everyday condition. And so it should be creatively done in the academia. So that's the challenge. Copycatting is not good, but intermixing and adapting creatively and giving useful interchange is the way to go forward. Am I sounding abstract? No, it's just what I'm just saying is, given the specific intellectual condition that we are in, post-colonial condition, how to intermix knowledges available in Indian languages and English is a second potential translatability problem we have. So that's the second. And third, disability studies can potentially and must usefully borrow from disability activism and other activisms that have happened. That is caste activism, gender activism, and many other Dravidian movements, for example, and so on. By this, we can actually set a model of transformative and care model of model of doing academics, really, because disability can on the one hand be a critique of these activisms, other activism, and second, it can also say very loudly, disability studies is no means a parochial, infighting field, but a broad intellectual and practical field that cares for accommodation, care, broader body politics, and so on. So these are the three problems of translatability that I put forward on the table for discussion. Thank you.
Who wants to go next? Thunman, if you've already got the microphone is moved, it's there, but I don't know if you want to pick up on anything that you say. I mean, in terms of, again, that broader question of whether there is anything specific about the South Asian context that we need to be taking into account.
Yes, yeah.
Or are we just reifying culture in some way? If we do that?
Right. So there is, I thought about it, and I think one needs to articulate this, let's say, quote-unquote, Indian disability studies more clearly, so more specifically, I think. So I'll take some examples. But recently, there's a book published, Disability in South Asia, edited by Anita Goenka, and many of us present here have articles in that. And I'll refer to a bit of the article that I have there. Disability in this year, 2018 actually, last year, it was published. And here, in this article, I make a very strong point, unnecessarily strong, I think. But the idea is to be able to see where disability studies in its various activities, because it is not really in the form of recognizable disability studies disciplines. As Hema said, several governments have plans to do that, but it has not really materialized in any meaningful manner. But we have to identify other pockets of disability studies in different forms that exist, and I'll refer to something else in this connection. But the point was that the Indianness of disability studies must take into account or at least clarify what I said, the controversial point is that over-presence or over-emphasis of services perspective in the studies, which is knowledge perspective. I know several people would cast aspersion to knowledge for knowledge's sake, but I think that needs to be taken into account. Is there too much of service, knowledge feeding to service, or everything activism feeding to service? And I think there is a strong connection with the charity discussion we almost had in the first roundtable. So I think that connection between charitability and service is very strong, and how far it feeds into disability studies, or how far disability studies actually feeds into service. That has not been articulated, questioned, or put into perspective. So my article was about that, and I took a very strong position, which I called the formality of estrangement or abeyance. Stay away from the services model for a while. I didn't give a time frame, but for a while, there is a strong connection between services and knowledge. But because of the overpresence of services, which seems to drive disability studies, shape of disability studies, and the fact that disability studies has not really taken off in our context has to be understood. So that was, I think, is an Indian perspective. And I don't know if this has been talked about in the literature too much. The other thing which I didn't mention in my introduction is that we have some of us here, many of us here actually running this disability studies reading group for 5 years now. I started it in 2012. Jagdish has been part of it. Hema was part of it for a while when he was in Delhi. Deepa is part of it, and Samir and many people here who are part of it, Sarmishta. And what we're trying to do is to stick to this principle, talking about disability experiences, talking about the need for services, and talking about knowledge. So these three things, how do they come together? And over the years, we sort of form certain perspective, which I think I will underline as disability, India-centric, India-specific disability perspective. One is for last 1 year, at least very specifically in all the papers that we have been reading, and then discussion woven around that reading. By the way, we never finish a reading. We barely start a reading, and there's too much of discussion. There are very talkative people in our group, so there's too much of discussion, but that I think is the most important part, and that's a recognizable disability studies outpouring, or the form of disability studies in these small groups of meetings. So there, over the years, we have realized that I think Hem underlined this little bit, and he called it routinization. That and people in disability studies, scholars have recognized this. That is too little bit of disability studies bad or good? Is it good that every, let's say, academic fields or every government organizations, or take a university, setup or any office, let's say the security guards, and let's say the director of the company or director of a university, and all the layers in between, should they be made aware of disability facts? And when I was in Equal Opportunity Cell, we ran several successful, intense awareness campaigns in different 70-odd colleges in Delhi. I ran myself 60 such awareness campaigns. But over the years, we're realizing that that has not really caused any kind of shaping disability studies. And we tend to believe now that little knowledge of disability is in the long run probably not useful. In fact, probably it is harmful. So we need to, and that's what I'm looking forward to, any kind of participation here. We need to evolve a language, a framework, where we can incorporate in our discourse this possibility of not just doing a little bit of disability studies, but more meaningful, whether through action or through words, more meaningful work, which does not have this sort of negative effect. Okay, so I think this is one of the things. And the third thing that I will take an example of is, I think Sharmishta earlier pointed out in the Roundtable 1, is this notion of care. And we sort of looked at it, just to cut a long story short, we looked at the semantics of the word care itself. And then somebody came up with this idea that, well, service was also a word which has a different semantics. And so government servants, for example, we all call ourselves government servants who are working in the government sector, and we are not, by the strict definition of the word service, we are not supposed to take any salaries. It is a service. But then that's unthinkable. So the word service has undergone that change. The word care has undergone a certain change in the disability sector. It doesn't really mean care in the emotional, psychological aspect, but care in the sense of, let's say, a little bit of rights, entitlements, etc. So the carer, the term carer, is not really emotionally involved in caring, but it is a position with some salary and with some structure in place. So that's we have to recognize this. I think that would be again an example of an Indian way of thinking about disability studies, how these kinds of things which make their entry into policies, how they have actually undergone change in terms of the meaning and the accompanying action with regards to that. So these are things that I would sort of like to underline. And I think inclusion is a big topic, so I don't want to really make a shortcut discussion, but just to be very specific about it, there is a lot of hatred for the word inclusion, at least in the Indian disability sector, not necessarily in disability studies or scholars, but it's seen to be quote unquote a Western concept. Okay, so, and there are very good reasons for critiquing that concept of inclusion. And there is a counter sort of argument saying that we are culturally invested into inclusion in any case. We have always been a very inclusive society, although you'll find less and less evidence of that, in the last 4 years or so. But apparently we're a very inclusive society, and we sort of include everybody. But if you think a little deeply about it, the kind of inclusion is really practiced. Even a day before yesterday, I was watching on, just looking out through window and watching people playing cricket, this people in our colony playing cricket. And there was this guy who was not really participating. I couldn't make out whether he was disabled or not. But then he was taken into the game. Although he would just occasionally come to bowl or occasionally come to bat, but he was taken into the game. Yet at the same time, nobody was really engaging in any conversations or jokes or laughing out jokes with him. So it seems to be there's a disconnection between, there's an inclusion, broadly it's an inclusion, but there seems to be a disconnection. So I don't think it's really inclusion. From my personal view is that this is just cultural inclusion. So I think these are the three aspects that I will recognize as Indian, very specific Indian aspect of disability studies.
Yeah. So the question is, can academia and activism coexist together? So when I'm in a company of disability rights organizations, I often say that I'm a disabled person. Or the contrary, when I'm in a company with non-disabled people, I say I'm a person with disability. So the question is, there are two different schools of thoughts. One is where humanities pick up a topic from medicine and critically analyze it. The second is, from which I belong, is that where we use the approaches which are from medical humanities, the new pedagogical approach of disability studies, and how we can use to actually improve doctor-patient relationship. So I will ask you a question, that how many of you have actually been treated by a healthcare professional with a disability? Just one or two people only. And this is the problem. We talk about the 1995 Act. In that act also, low vision and hearing impairment, they were specified disabilities. But you will never ever see a doctor with low vision or hearing impairment till 2018, despite being two legislations now. And once again, last year, when I say we, I refer to doctors with disabilities organizations. We have to move the Ministry of Health to actually denounce the Medical Council of India guidelines, which debarred people with dyslexia, people with thalassemia, which are newer disabilities, people with hearing impairment, people with low vision, the right to become doctors. Until and unless we have doctors with disabilities, invisibility, how can we improve the patient care? If you see the example, we talk about the common famous three disabilities, but now we have dyslexia. And in engineering systems, we have reservations for dyslexic. They also get accommodations in examination. On the contrary, last year when these dyslexic applied for medical education, without any extra time, they were termed as ineligible. They had to go to court, and after the intervention of the Honorable Supreme Court, Ashutosh Puruswani with low vision, Tina Sharma with hearing impairment are now pursuing medical education in Delhi and Ahmedabad. So now this is right now after 22 years, for the very first time the Medical Council of India is changing the medical curriculum. They have come up with a competency-based medical education curriculum, which all the medical students, future medical students, from August 2019 onwards will read, and they will train in that, will become doctors. However, it is still heavily based on medical model of disability. So that's why recently, last Saturday only, I led a team of, this was a project, Disability Inclusive Compassionate Care, where we actually did focused group discussions with the real stakeholders. There were FGDs with doctors with disabilities, there were FGDs with the disability rights organization and medical teachers. And all three groups had different takes. Rights were not on the agenda of doctors with disabilities. So that, break my own perception, because I am very vocal about this, that nothing about us without us, because I am a person with locomotor disability. But when I led those FGDs, it was never on their agenda. They were not bothered by the rights. On the contrary, the disability rights organizations, they gave the maximum inputs on focused group discussions, the interviews which we recorded. So it was on the agenda of rights activists. They were very vocal about disability rights. On the contrary, the medical teachers who have been trained till now, they had absolutely no idea how to communicate with a deaf person. They are ignorant then that when you open your laptop, the person who is there, the deaf person, they can actually lip read. They have absolutely no idea. When they are treating a blind lady for a pregnancy, not treating rather, for a general checkup of the pregnancy, they are telling the details of that, pregnancy to the attendant, her brother-in-law, and she shouted that I am only blind, but I can listen. These are the experiences which are there in the healthcare. The reason being, there is no visibility of doctors with disabilities. There has been so many literature written by, there are doctors with dyslexia who are talking about these things. Because in US, it is entirely up to you whether you disclose your disability or not. Here, right now, when you entered it, it is being labeled that, of course, you are disabled in PWD category, and you have through this quota. So there is no option of, confidentiality, the autonomy. In the new curriculum, which is up there, you just control F and search the words dignity, 0 returns. The UNCRPD and our rights for persons with disabilities act is talked about inherent dignity. It is not there, but it is there in this particular booklet, which we have come up with these disability competencies. They have, as Hema said earlier, they have copy-pasted things from the West. They talked about shared decision making, which is a very buzzword in bioethics. Unfortunately, in India, US has not yet ratified UNCRPD, right? India has ratified it. We have Mental Health Care Act, which is UNCRPD compliant, came up last year, 2017. It talks about supported decision making. We provide legal capacity to those people. So a concept of shared decision making will be a mismatch in our Indian context. And we have to recognize that. In that conference, there was a person who was deaf-blind, Zamir Dhale. We asked the doctors in the audience, please come forward. He is come for a OPD consultations. Please ask him. And they were in a fix, what to do. Forget about sign language, it was a matter of tactile sign language. And they had absolutely no clue. So these are the experiential learning, reflective capacity, narrative competence, what we talk about, which has to be there in the curriculum, the new medical curriculum. And for the first time, I can give you the example of moving from academia to activism. Our Disability Act, which is there, and many of the state disability acts, you will not find the word doctors with disabilities anywhere there. On the contrary, the Delhi state rules for persons with disabilities, I was part of that committee, And there is a section in our disability legislation, research on disabled persons. In that, I have made it a point that they include the word, there has to, in that committee, there has to be a doctor with disability, who is a doctor, medical doctor, and who has the lived experience of disability. Only then you will talk about the concepts of ethics of autonomy, shared supported decision making, and the other things. So these are my few takes.
Before we pass over to Nikhil and Jagdish, we do want to hear from, but I thought it might be good at this point to open up a bit and take some points from the audience, and then I will come back to you two first to respond. Do we have anybody who wants to? Again, I think we have somebody here. Do we have another microphone?
Can I speak just without mic? Since it's a disability studies question, hi, my name is Abhishek Goenka. I wanted to know how does disability studies in India deal with the karmic theory, which is the root cause of a lot of stigma, especially in the rural areas. It's a root cause of a lot of stigma against disabled people. And how can disability studies in India deal with that? Either we reject it completely or take it into account. How do we deal with that?
Nikhil, do you want to? The mic is in front. Would you like to answer?
No, I think Jagdish can answer.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think it might be very controversial, and I think I'll be put up on a defensive pedestal if I say this. But the counter to the karma theory is also the dharma theory. If you understand, and I think in the Indian rural context, I would not mind. I know I come from a disability rights perspective. The panel here is all from disability rights perspective. And if we talk about dharma, that would be taken as a part of the charity concept. But I think translating that in the Indian context, karma theory is very much prevalent. And I think 70% of India's population, whatever, still lives, majority of India's population still lives in the rural areas. You cannot tell them this is your right to be cured, or this is your right, this is what you're entitled to. I think the very easiest way, if I have to go as a disability trainer to any village, community, remote area, I would say, in India, there is a concept of karma theory, कि बुरे कर्म किए थे इसलिए ऐसा हो गया. But there's also a concept of dharma theory, कि आपका भी धर्म बनता है, you be nice to the disabled people.
Can I add it to that? Oh, all right. Okay. I think I agree with him. Then added to this, that how you see in the karma theory, like and there is whole relationship of power, and it's built around that. That when you say that a person is born blind or deaf or whatever, right? He's destined to be like that. So you are making a disabled a recipient of certain things, and even if you give him entitlements or give certain provisions of aids and appliances, then they're only you're depriving him of even either saying something or being a part of decision making process, and or like I would say responding to what you're doing to that. So I think even in the Indian context, it needs to be displaced. I would say, and there are lobbying, against that, and that is where I bring in the concept of Divyang actually. Perhaps maybe people may be disturbed, but certainly yes, that kind of notion it is certainly in that tune, in that vicinity perhaps, because it's saying that you're destined to be disabled, but whether even if you are worshipped, but certainly you're destined to be disabled. So you're happy with that, And can I move on to other things which I wanted to say? Or
Yeah, just to add on the karma point, I think as an anthropologist, what I would be interested in would not be the kind of official renderings in ancient Hindu texts about karma and what that has to say, but how people who we encounter, whether in villages or in urban environments or wherever it might be, how they might engage or not engage with those concepts and how they might make them their own in often very particular ways, which can be quite far removed from karma as it might be taught in schools or might be talked about in the temple context, for example. I think also Samir wanted to make, I don't know if it was a related point, and then we'll come back to you. Nikhil, you can do that.
Hello. Huh. Uh, yes, as James has pointed out, as an anthropologist, we are more concerned how that particular theory is played out in the field, and there are multiple ways through which it gets interpreted. But like my intervention would be on the question of like how, like if there is a person with disability doctor, which I would also want, but there is a larger perspective of, you know, negativization of his capabilities. Oh, his person with disability, how well he could treat us. So how we are going to tackle these negativizations, like if at all, like I was sharing with him just right now, that there is somebody who asked me, oh, visually impaired person teach at school level, how come they teach? And what about discipline? How student would learn discipline, which is very vital for leading a productive life? So I argue that no, you are being very ignorant. Like we person with impairment teach, or we could go to various other disciplines, or we could we could break those barriers. But what about these attitudinal barriers which is there, which questions our capabilities? It is like
Sabir, can I answer that? Yeah. So the first thing is that it is very difficult to change attitudes and behaviors. You can spend your entire lifetime, you cannot change anybody's behavior because it is not under your control. But what we can do is that you raise the very pertinent question of how doctors with disabilities will be visualized. But what you are saying is your presumption. How many doctors with disabilities have you actually seen? There is enough literature outside India which very clearly states, evidence-based literature, that doctors with disabilities, they are more empathetic, and these are the responses of the patients who are not disabled. So there is a literature, but the problem is we do not see them. The first myth is that we have to break the shackles of MCI and the Ministry of Health, which are putting a condition over there. In India, the first rehabilitation department for disabled people was started by Dr. Mary Varghese, who was a surgeon on a wheelchair, long time back at CMC Vellore. India's bone marrow transplant program has been successfully started by a wheelchair user doctor in Mumbai, Dr. Suresh Advani. I can give you many examples. I am part of Doctors with Disabilities group. We have doctors with hearing impairment who are gynecologists. Last year, there was a candidate who is deaf, and he was denied admission. He went to Supreme Court, and he will become a doctor. So the time has now come that we need to break these stereotypes. I am doing a research on what are the perceptions of doctors on colorblind doctors. There are many colorblind doctors who are there. So what is their perception? So my second step would be what is the perception, because right now, after last year intervention by the Honorable Supreme Court, we now have dyslexic doctors, we have hemophilia, and doctors with thalassemia, we have doctors with low vision. All of these will be there. They are studying now in the first year. So I would like to do focus group interviews with them, what is their experience, and how the society is taking them up. Anybody can become disabled right now because there are road traffic accidents are so common, but they are still doing their duties. There is a pharmacologist who was the first blind doctor. He acquired disability. Same thing happened in AIIMS also, the Premier Institute, but nobody rejected them. They are serving society. Not every doctor with disability has to become a surgeon. You can teach like me. I am in physiology. I can do research. You can do skin, dermatology. There are so many specialties are over there. The thing is that we need visibility, that doctors with disabilities, this term, do exist.
Thank you. I think you raised a very important question, and where disability studies may certainly add and contribute. Like for instance, I give you an example that a child with any disability, which can I? Like goes to a doctor, for instance, a blind person goes to a doctor, and what will be the duty of a doctor? Like what will the doctor will respond? His first impression would be how to cure a blind person. Will he also be concerned about the education of a blind person or other requirements of a blind person? Or does he, will he consider a blind person to be as equal as an active citizen as other patients, as he gives attention to that? So there, I think it's been a pretty long demand that to include disability aspect in the medical education, and tell doctors about what is the implication of disability and how to maybe in kind of how to be oriented, how to negotiate with the different disabilities. So this is one thing I think could be done. And second, I would go further, that how the disability could be interpreted in different other syllabi, that not only these professions of engineering, medical professions, and like if you see the University of Delhi and JNU and many other universities, though there are centers in different universities like Nalsar, there are Hyderabad and many other, Mumbai, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, but in other mainstream universities, the major courses do not have any component of disability. So, and there I connected it, because disability studies and activism has, I think, a very deep relationship. And that we have seen in the West also, that how the activism has influenced studies, and how the studies has created activism. And particularly in the context of how we see caste, how we see gender, that there are movements in India on gender. Even in different universities, there are movements on gender, on roster, on gender sensitivities. Do we have seminars on daily basis on disability studies? Like there are seminars being organized in different universities, but who are the participants? Are they the non-disabled also? And if there are, they may be. I'm not judgmental, but certainly there are questions to be asked to ourselves. And as a part of Sambhavna organization, we have organized. But I think it's also for us to recognize that who are the parties, who are the audience. So is disability creating a space in the society, and whether the society is accommodating disability as one of the vantage point? Because I certainly would like to say that when we organized a conference on constitution amendment in 2010 in Gandhi Peace Foundation, and there was very low participation. People certainly did not understand why there is a need for a person with disabilities to be part of the constitution. So this is how the politics operates. We have to recognize, and how the activism recognizes. Very, very recently, I think, say 1 week ago, there was an election, Academic Council and Executive Council election. And one of the non-disabled colleague stopped a disabled colleague who was a blind person not to vote with the trusted candidate person. He said that you can't go for voting with a trusted candidate. You don't have you cannot decide about what person you have to choose. So this is how in actuality the politics and operates. And secondly, I would say that at the larger level, the activism, and I would certainly say that in the context of RPD Act, and there I will leave for you to discuss. RPD Act is a very concrete act, a very powerful act. Certainly it's a development over the PWD Act. But when it was finally placed in the parliament, was it being discussed by the parliamentarians? And if not, why? Because whether does it mount to be passed like this? So this is how I think I would see disability. I wrote it post in the Facebook. I don't consider it vital, but certainly I did it because I think that for parliamentarians, the issue of disability was certainly was a marginalized one for me. So disability study has to not only educate the academia, but also the activist, like us, and also the politicians and quote unquote the civic society people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Michelle, I've got a question from you, I think.
So I think it was interesting to think about what you were saying, Nikhil, in relation to what Tanmoy was saying earlier about, you know, a little bit of disability studies not being productive, you know, and I wanted to hear a little bit more from Tanmoy about that. You know, what are some of the harms associated with doing a little bit of disability studies, especially now that doing a little bit of disability studies, sorry, yeah, too fast? Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So thank you. So my question was about the way that there might have been an interesting contradiction or source of tension between what Nikhil was saying and maybe what Satendra was saying and what Tanmoy was saying, because Tanmoy was saying earlier that doing a little bit of disability studies might actually be harmful, you know. And I'm interested in thinking about what that might mean, because doing a little bit of disability studies seems to be in vogue now, and it seems to be mandated by, you know, universities, by the state, and by other people. And so how might, you know, disability studies scholars actually protest that and say, we don't want to do disability studies as you want us to do it?
And before you respond to that, I think Shilpa has a microphone.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Okay. So we'll take a couple more questions and then we'll return to the panelists.
Okay.
Shilpa.
Yeah, this is Shilpa, and I'm just adding to some of the points that Hema Chandra made, James made, and Tanmoy also made, and maybe in a way responding to Michelle, because I'm a little anxious about this imposition to do disability studies, that there's a certain kind of mandate, because there's also a problem of what the self-evident category of disability is. I mean, if at all, it's already a self-evident concept. And in that, I want to, in a way, respond to Abhishek's question. See, I think one of the points Hema Chandra was making was to bring together different threads of knowledge as well, and therefore strengthen disability studies in a way. So this idea of karma and the way that you phrased it for me would be a very Orientalist idea of karma. That there is a body of knowledge that has produced karma is associated with India in a certain way, and then we are just, you know, adopting that and taking it forward. So I think there's been some talk about decolonizing, and for me, that would be an important point of departure, to actually think about what does the medical mean, or what does the social mean, especially given that we live in a context where the medical does not refer to only biomedicine, and you know, the multiple modes of treatment and so on. Yeah, so I think the way to push disability studies forward would be to take it back to that women's studies question that we all dealt with. Should women's studies have these separate centers, or should it be taught through different departments? And I think we have a great panel of people who are all doing it in political science, medicine, English literature, linguistics, and so on. So I think I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
I think we had another question.
Check. Can everyone see me well, especially the deaf audience? I have a question to most of the panel members. Oh yes, I'm sorry. I'm Dr. Alim Chandani. At this point of time in the country, in India, I am focusing on developing a new company, focusing on establishing a national resource center for the deaf. But most of my education and rearing is from the United States. My parents actually found out when I was deaf, they decided to move me out of this country. I was born in India. And growing up, I went to universities, 5 different universities throughout my life. 4 of them are mainstream. More non-disabled, non-deaf students specifically. And except for Gallaudet University, which is the world's only liberal arts university for the deaf. Going to mainstream universities, not wanting to use the hearing universities term, I asked them provide support services. What kind of support services are available? Are there real-time captioning for the lectures? Live captioning system to teachers, whatever they're saying is, I do have that material in text. Do we have note takers or scribes in college and academia where I'm applying for master's and BA programs? And they were there. Why? Because the law mandates it. RPWD, the Rights of Person with Disability 2016, and the Americans with Disability Act, ADA, it's required by educational institutions per se, period. The college would take care of the support service, pay for it, and the entire support service is given to me without me demanding. It's a very equal type of environment where I don't have to depend. But 2016, when I moved to India, I thought maybe situations have changed. There are many deaf leaders, many organizations, and I knew about the RPWD had been passed. And many students, deaf especially, getting BA, BCom sector, bachelorates and working in the IT sector. So I asked them, how are you managing to pass these courses? They were like, you know, we study before the exams, mostly wrote, and the teachers pass us. So I was like, wow, this is a major problem that universities, bachelor's, BCom, BA, MA degrees in India don't have support system, and the universities. Where are the support service unit where you have various accessibility services streamlined and specific for the various kind of disabilities, but we don't have it in the universities and colleges. So I'm wondering, how can support services units in universities provide this as a mandate? Let me give you an example. If I decide to come to your University of Chicago, for example, this particular university, I decide to take a course, some MA course, some other field. Now, will this part of the unit, University of Chicago in Chicago mandates it, but does University of Chicago Center India provide the support service which I need?
There is one here. We'll take one more question and then we'll come back.
I'm MB Chandra from Department of Slavonic Studies, Delhi University. What it seems from the panel discussion, it seems that every department, every field, they require a disability studies, and they need a representative to defend their position. So how do you think that such is possible, and what time it will take, if at all it is to be implemented?
Yeah, I think it will be good to go back to a question posed at the beginning by Abhishek and Samir. I think both were questioning how do we break the stereotypes. Satin, of course, tried to answer to Samir's question, but I think it's how to break the stereotypes and how to incorporate that into our studies or education. So let's say critical disability studies, that's what my response to you is, that by doing this abeyance from services, I'm getting into critical disability studies. In the critical disability studies perspective, we won't just look at this as stray incident. Okay, we will see what is the context, how these doctors with disability are not visible. So it's not really about MBBS education. You can only educate them up to certain point, but the education has already happened in the school, in the primary school. There is a total absence of disability-related education at the primary school level. Okay, there is no language of teaching, and there is no expertise, and there is no framework for teaching. So for a critical disability studies perspective, I will even criticize, let's say, Satyin's position or intervention into the MCI, Medical Council of India, and trying to come up with the guideline, which are all very good. It contributes to it. But the real issue would be to how to break the stereotypes. Today in this century, we're talking about how to break the stereotypes, how to be politically correct, etc. But really, it's like, how do we not have a mind which does not have prejudice? That is, I think, the bigger question that Samir was pointing at. How do you control a mind without prejudice, and how do you go about it? And I think this has to be a very contextually overall response. It cannot be just in one guideline, set of guidelines, but it has to be overhauling the education system. And that's why I said that maybe we won't have time to talk about this inclusion, the philosophy of inclusion. But when Deepa was giving her introduction, she talked passionately about the rural people not being taken into account. What she was talking about is that perspective has not filtered into the policies. Policies are just a filtered instruments. They're not really. But then you can do that. You can have a committee, you can have another government, another future government will do that. But that's not the end of the story. What I'm talking about is a common person's view. How do you break that stereotype? So I don't think it is a disability particular issue, but it is the same thing in caste, in gender, in race, in all sorts of other such binarities. So I think that is the bigger issue we should be addressing at. And from a, when I say that there is a disconnect between what I'm protesting, or not really protesting, but I'm arguing against, is that overemphasis on services, because it tends to take us away from, knowledge generation. I think knowledge is not a bad word. Knowledge generation is moving away from our society more and more. There's more information. And this brings us back to that other superficial, by which I mean surface related question, is that is too little of disability is bad, little disability studies or awareness is bad for the field as such. And I think it is, because it is decontextualized. This awareness programs, or this, let's say, guidelines in MCI, or even in some kind of, yeah. The first time I gave the full form, okay? So, yeah. So I think that it is important to realize that it is not, nothing is decontextualized, single agenda, and we try to solve that. We have to understand the background, the karma, for example, the background. How do we educate people against it? Or the dharma that Jagdish talked about. How do we educate? So we're really talking about karma as past and dharma as future in a way. So it's kind of beneficence of the accreditation of the past and the beneficence of the future. How do we incorporate that? How do you understand that in terms of, let's say, our education policies? It's not really about disability policies. Disability policies, as I said, will at some point include these things. But how do we tackle, mass education at a very grassroots level, where this question doesn't arise in the mind at all, that this is a result of our karma? And if I do some daan or some service, I will get some kind of points when I die, after I die. So this is, I think, a debate which will be ongoing until and unless we tackle what the, like Satyan will be able to add to that, what is the real cause of the disease, to use a term, disease, what is the real cause of it, and not diagnose on the basis of certain surface symptoms alone.
I would like to add to Alim's question that he gets accommodation in America because of ADA. What will happen in India? I will give you the example of what happened in the Supreme Court of India last year, when there was this case of low vision candidate clearing medical examination who wants to become a doctor. The opposition lawyer from the medical council, he went to great length to justify that these are not fit to become doctors, because we have to change everything. We have to change our curriculum into braille, into large fonts. We have to use sign language interpreters. That was the reason being given in the highest court. And none of the judges or the opposition, they ever interacted with that low vision candidate. Or in Delhi High Court, the girl with deafness. Nobody ever communicated with those people. Why do you want to become a doctor? Getting on to the second aspect, for example, when we prepared these competencies, we sought for the feedback. And there was one competency that an Indian medical doctor must be able to differentiate medical versus social model of disability. We got numerous feedback. One school of people said that no, it is still a medical approach, why you are using that. For example, why you are diagnosing impairment, certification based on functional competence. Other were very vocal that this is, you are talking about social model of disability. But even Michael Oliver, who gave the social model of disability later on, it was criticized by Tom Shakespeare, who was initially very vocal about the social model of disability. And even if you look at very analytically, even the UNCRPD is not on social model, rather it is on a human rights based model. So we have actually 3 different set of models, and many of people do not know the basic difference between these things. And that's why we refine our competencies to include human rights approach rather than justifying to one medical or social. Moreover, in that discussions which we had, there was one from Chronic Pain India. There was a lady and she said that, you know, social model is fine for advocacy, that society makes us disabled, but it does not cater to the needs of those who have impairment. All these people talk about social model, but when they go back in closed rooms, they share their pain, they share their urinary impairments, they share that this is part of existence. In cerebral palsy, in many post-polio syndrome, chronic pain is a reality. You cannot say that we can ultimately discard the medical model. It just cannot happen. You cannot remove impairment from the social model. We need to have an integrated approach for that.
Okay, well, a couple of things. I think firstly, I must also clarify what I said in response to Abhishek. I definitely don't mean to encourage non-scientific ideas. And of course, the best way to break down or reject the karma theory is through a scientific idea, saying, you know, explaining what Dharma was saying, that it's basically, it's not the result of your past karma, it's basically scientific reasons for it, and that's how it has happened. But of course, when I said maybe one counter argument to karma would be a dharma, and that's something when I'm talking about when you're in Rome, do as Romans do. I mean, this idea of breaking down, rejecting the karma theory through a scientific idea would work in the colleges and universities, and I think the educated circle. But if you go to the village society where they don't understand, where they firmly believe in the idea of karma, and they would also firmly believe in the idea of punya and dharma, I think the easiest way to explain them कि भगवान ने जब इनके लिए बुरा कर दिया पिछले जन्म में ऐसे किए थे, तो आपको तो पुण्य कमाने का मौका है, maybe you should be nice to them. I hope I make sense. I mean, I hope I make my position clear. One thing before I go on to my own remarks, also I think what Satyendra has been talking about, having a representation of doctors with disabilities, and to me, I think that's one thing. I mean, I'm supporting it, but more importantly, I also realize one theme that has come again and again repeatedly is, I think doctors are a group of people where if somebody acquires disability, that's the first group of people one comes across. And if they are not sensitized, if they are not educated enough, I think that's where the problem starts. So to me, I think maybe it sounds like too much arbitrary, but it has, I think it should be made compulsory by Medical Council of India that there should be a course, compulsory course on disability studies in the medical curriculum, on bioethics, on disability course content that would have topics on bioethics, topic on disability rights perspective, and accepting even, you know, as you are, even if you have an impairment. Okay, having reflected upon that, I want to come back to my own, some of the remarks that I want to make quickly. You know, if you look at the legal provisions or laws or developments in any post-colonial society, broadly, I think they can be, by and large, not always, but to a great extent, be attributed to two sources. First, I'm talking about a post-colonial society. So the first source would be a colonial legacy. Many of the laws, we still have the 1860 Act, we still have the, what is that act about 1884, you know, in which the Sedition Act. So many of the laws we still have, they have to be attributed to the colonial past, colonial legacy. Second source that happens in the post-colonial societies for the laws is the international developments. And I think the laws in the disability field are not really kind of far from these influences. And what we find, RPD Act, I'm a big fan of it. And but what we also need to understand, the whole process of framing of the RPD Act, firstly, we all are clear, it's been highly influenced by UNCRPD. Again, I'm a big fan of UNCRPD, I'm not opposed to it. Secondly, if you look at the process of framing of the RPD Act, the whole national consultation that have taken place, just understand, if you look at the identity, and I know, again, I don't want to get into the identity politics, which Deepa was also talking about. I don't want to get into the urban-rural binary. But if you look at the composition of the national consultation membership, I think if I could make if it's not an exaggeration, I think I can say with confidence 70% of the people who contributed to the framing of the RPT Act, who participated in the whole process, they were from urban middle class background. Do they represent the rural masses of India? And I think that's where Deepa's question in the morning becomes very relevant. Again, I'm not opposed to disability rights. I come from a Western education background. My PhD is from American University. My PhD is again in disability studies from one of the best programs in US. So I'm not opposing the kind of concept of rights. And again, but we have to understand the whole thing in a holistic perspective, in a very much Indian context, what language, and when I'm talking about one way of rejecting the karma theory is to promote the dharma theory. I'm speaking in that very specific context that our society is located into. And I think that's where disability studies have to learn from. If I look at the primary sources of disability studies back in the West, especially the university that I come from, I would say there have been two primary sources of disability studies, especially in US. One is, of course, the disability rights movement. Second is the self-narratives of the disabled people themselves, something that comes from the Chicago School of Sociology. So these are the two sources on which disability studies in the West has built up upon, self-narratives and disability rights movement. And I'm saying, I think, so in the Indian context, again, we have to learn from the disability rights movement. But the issue is, where is this movement based from? If you look at the character of the disability rights movement in India, it's very much urban, middle class led movement. So I think, I'm not saying we should not ask for flight, concessions in airlines. I'm not saying we should not ask for interpreters in the school and college. Everything is definitely needed. And everything should be given, I would say, as a matter of entitlements. But then we need to understand what is the larger reality of our Indian society. Where do the majority of the disabled people live? And is the disability rights discourse taking into account their needs and their arguments? And I think in the morning, one of the person was saying, maybe perhaps Deepa, that somebody in the village would say, I don't care for 4 steps. What I need is my pension. And to me, that is a greater reality. Okay, yeah. So I think this is something our disability studies will be enriched if we take at the larger socio-economic realities of our society. And but unfortunately, who determines the agenda is the international agencies, which are funding agencies, what Deepa was saying, and people like you and me sitting in this room, the urban middle class. And I think that's where we are going to be failing in evolving an indigenous model of disability studies. Again, I also want to say, please do not misunderstand me that I'm not against disability studies perspective, the way it's been going on, or the rights perspective. What I'm trying to say, if I'm making clear, is we have to, now there is a growing emphasis on rural sociology in India. Sorry, yes, okay. So last point I want to conclude. Say for example, one of the discussions we had in the last 2 days about this word Divyang. Of course, I'm one of the people who would strongly oppose the use of the word Divyang. But then what is the alternative? Is Viklang in Hindi is alternative? For example, in Bengal, people had come up with this term Pratobandhit Jan. Means restricted. Pratobandhit Jan. No. Well, prohibit would be, I think that, no, here the appropriate translation would be restricted people, okay? People who are barriered, people who are obstacled. Similarly, for a very long time in the blindness sector, there has been a debate about what should be appropriate word for blindness in Hindi. For a common usage. People hated the word andha, people hated the word surdas, which was popularly associated with. There were many other alternatives which were offered in the past, but now I think the consensus which is evolving is the word drishti badhit, the people whose sight is obstructed. And I think this is an indigenous development, and this is not going to come from this room. It's basically going to come from the disability rights perspective, which has to be rooted in the Indian context. Yes.
Sorry. I mean, one of the things there you were talking about, you were talking very much about the disability studies perspective or a disability rights perspective. And I think, I'm not sure we've got time to, answer this now because we're coming to the end of our time, but what precisely is that? Or that somebody's disability rights perspective might be quite different to somebody else's disability studies perspective. I think one of the other interesting things that was emerging, I think, in that discussion was this kind of tension between between an activism, a disability rights activism, which looks at correcting people's perceptions and people's perceptions of the world, and a kind of disability studies which actually tries to document and understand those perspectives. And I'm kind of interested in how we might navigate the way between those two things. So rather than going into a village with an assumption that people have particular views about karma or dharma or whatever it might be, that we perhaps first need to be using not just disability studies, but the kind of work that we do as social scientists and in other fields to really find out actually what people's perspectives on the ground might be. I think it's dead on 2 o'clock now, so I think we're precisely out of time. I don't know if there are any urgent final points that Samir wants to make a final point. So we'll let him make the final point and then we'll stop. Am I allowed to do that, or will you kill me, Michelle? Okay. No, you can't. Sorry.
Just one point. Are we again making binaries? As in, what about the guy who has initially been schooled in a rural atmosphere, but then did his degrees from Hindu college, DU, TIS, and so on and so forth. As in, what about the guy who at the later age become aware about his or her rights or something? So yes.